Picture this. You've worked your entire life toward one goal. You've pushed your body beyond every limit, mastered skills that would terrify most people, and proven yourself worthy of wearing one of the most respected uniforms in the world. Then, on the most important day of your career, you discover that uniform has vanished. Not lost, not misplaced, stolen. By people who believe you don't deserve to wear it simply because you're a woman. Most people would crumble. Most would accept defeat. Most would walk away. Sarah Martinez wasn't most people. What happened next didn't just shock everyone in that military training facility. It sent shockwaves through the entire special operations community and changed the course of military history forever. Because when they took away her standard uniform, thinking they'd humiliated her into quitting, Sarah showed up wearing something that made every person in that room question everything they thought they knew about strength, determination, and what it truly means to be a warrior. This is the story of how one woman's refusal to be broken didn't just open doors for future generations of female soldiers. It redefined what those doors could even look like. Sarah Martinez grew up in a small town in Texas where Friday nights meant high school football and Sunday mornings meant church. Her father, Miguel Martinez, was a mechanic who worked with his hands and believed in fixing things rather than replacing them. Her mother, Elena, taught elementary school and had a way of making even the most difficult children believe they could achieve anything. Sarah was their only daughter, sandwiched between two older brothers who treated her like she was made of glass, and a younger brother who challenged her to prove she wasn't. From the time she could walk, Sarah was different. While other little girls were playing with dolls, she was in the backyard with her brothers, building forts and playing war games. She climbed higher trees, ran faster races, and never backed down from a dare. Her mother worried she was too rough, too aggressive, too willing to get dirty. Her father secretly admired her spirit, but wondered if the world would be kind to a girl who refused to fit into neat categories. When Sarah was 8 years old, something happened that would shape the rest of her life. Her family was watching the evening news when a story came on about female soldiers serving overseas. The reporter was interviewing a woman in military uniform who had just returned from deployment. Sarah's eyes were glued to the television as this woman, barely older than her own mother, talked about leading men into dangerous situations and making decisions that saved lives. "Mija, what are you thinking about so hard?" her father asked, noticing how intently she was watching. "I want to be like her," Sarah said without taking her eyes off the screen. "I want to be a soldier." Her brothers laughed. Even at 8 years old, they thought the idea was ridiculous. Girls didn't become soldiers, especially not girls from their small town. Her mother looked worried, the kind of worry that comes from loving someone and knowing the world can be cruel to people who dare to be different. But her father saw something in Sarah's eyes that reminded him of himself at that age, when he had dreamed of being more than just a mechanic in a small town. "If that's what you want, Mija, then we'll figure out how to make it happen," he said quietly. From that moment on, Sarah's life had direction. While other kids her age were trying to figure out what they wanted to be when they grew up, Sarah was already preparing for her future. She joined every sports team her school offered. She ran track, played soccer, and even convinced the coach to let her try out for the wrestling team. She was the only girl, and she lost most of her matches at first, but she kept showing up. She kept learning. She kept getting stronger. Her grades were excellent, but not because she was naturally brilliant. Sarah worked harder than anyone else in her class. She understood that becoming a soldier required more than just physical strength. She needed to be smart, disciplined, and capable of learning quickly under pressure. She read everything she could find about military history, strategy, and tactics. She memorized the names of famous battles and studied the decisions that won or lost wars. When she turned 16, Sarah convinced her parents to let her join a local military preparatory program that met on weekends. Most of the other participants were boys who were planning to attend military academies or who had family members in the service. Sarah was one of only 3 girls, and the instructors made it clear that they weren't sure girls belonged in the program at all. "This isn't summer camp," Sergeant Reynolds told the group on their first day. "We're here to prepare future leaders of the American military. That means learning discipline, following orders, and pushing yourselves beyond what you think is possible. Some of you won't make it through the first month." He wasn't wrong. Of the 30 kids who started the program, only 18 finished. One of the girls dropped out after the second weekend, saying it was too hard and too mean. The other girl made it 6 weeks before deciding she'd rather focus on her part-time job at the mall. Sarah not only finished the program, she graduated at the top of her class. The transformation was remarkable. The teenage girl who had always been tough and determined had become something else entirely. She carried herself differently, spoke with more confidence, and had developed an unshakable sense of purpose. Her high school guidance counselor tried to steer her toward colleges with strong ROTC programs, but Sarah had already made up her mind. She was going to enlist immediately after graduation and work her way up through the ranks. Her parents had mixed feelings about her decision. They were proud of her determination and impressed by how focused she had become, but they worried about sending their daughter into a world that might not be ready for her. The military was changing, they knew that, but change came slowly to institutions that had operated the same way for decades. "Are you sure this is what you want?" her mother asked her the night before she left for basic training. "You could still change your mind. You could go to college, become an officer. That might be easier." Sarah shook her head. "I don't want easier, Mom. I want to earn it. I want to prove that I belong there just like everyone else." Basic training was everything Sarah had expected and nothing like she had prepared for. The physical challenges were difficult, but manageable. She had spent years conditioning her body for exactly this kind of punishment. The mental challenges were harder. Learning to function as part of a unit, to follow orders without question, to suppress her individual instincts in favor of group discipline required a fundamental rewiring of how she thought about herself and her place in the world. The social challenges were the hardest of all. There were other women in her training unit, but Sarah quickly realized that most of them were planning to work in support roles or administrative positions. They weren't preparing for combat roles, and they didn't understand why she was pushing herself so hard to excel in areas that traditionally belonged to men. The male recruits fell into two categories. Some of them treated her like a curiosity, a novelty that would eventually wash out and return to civilian life. They weren't mean, exactly, but they didn't take her seriously either. The others saw her as a threat to something they considered sacred. They had grown up believing that military service, especially combat roles, was one of the few remaining spaces where men could prove their worth in ways that women simply couldn't match. Sarah's presence challenged that belief, and some of them resented her for it. Her drill sergeant, Staff Sergeant Williams, was a career soldier who had served multiple deployments and had strong opinions about women in combat roles. He wasn't cruel to Sarah, but he made it clear that she would have to work twice as hard as everyone else to earn his respect. She would have to be faster, stronger, and tougher than any of the men in her unit, and even then, he wasn't sure she had what it took to succeed in the roles she was pursuing. "Martinez," he said to her during the third week of training, after she had just completed a particularly grueling obstacle course faster than anyone else in her unit. "You've got heart, I'll give you that. But heart isn't enough where you're planning to go. The special operations community doesn't care about your feelings or your determination. They care about results, and they care about the people next to them knowing they can count on you when everything goes wrong." "Yes, Sergeant," Sarah replied. "I understand. I don't think you do," he said. "But maybe you will." Sarah graduated from basic training with honors, but she knew that was just the beginning. The real challenges lay ahead, in advanced training programs that would determine whether she could compete for the elite positions she had dreamed about since childhood. She had proven she could meet the same standards as her male counterparts, but meeting standards and excelling beyond them were two different things. Her first assignment was to a logistics unit in North Carolina, where she would spend 2 years learning military operations from the ground up. It wasn't the glamorous position she had envisioned, but Sarah understood it was a necessary step. She threw herself into the work with the same intensity she had brought to everything else in her life. She volunteered for extra duties, studied regulations during her off hours, and quietly began preparing for the next phase of her journey. During her time in logistics, Sarah met other women who were pushing boundaries in their own ways. She learned about the political battles being fought in Washington over women in combat roles, the legal challenges, and policy changes that were slowly opening doors that had been closed for generations. She realized that her individual success or failure would have implications beyond her own career. She was part of a larger movement, whether she wanted to be or not. The opportunity she had been waiting for came during her second year. The military announced that it was opening certain special operations training programs to female candidates on an experimental basis. The standards wouldn't be lowered, the announcement made clear. Female candidates would have to meet exactly the same physical and mental requirements as their male counterparts. Most military analysts predicted that very few women would even attempt the training, and fewer still would successfully complete it. Sarah knew this was her moment. She had spent years preparing for an opportunity that might never come. Now it was here, and she had no intention of wasting it. She submitted her application the day the program opened to female candidates, and immediately began the most intense preparation regimen of her life. The training program she was applying for was known for breaking even the strongest and most determined candidates. It was designed to identify individuals who could perform at the highest levels under the most extreme conditions. Physical strength was important, but mental toughness was essential. Candidates had to demonstrate they could think clearly under pressure, adapt to rapidly changing situations, and maintain their effectiveness even when exhausted, stressed, and pushed beyond normal human limits. Sarah's commanding officer called her into his office the week after she submitted her application. Colonel Harrison was a fair man who had watched her work for nearly 2 years and had been impressed by her dedication and competence. But he was also a realist who understood the challenges she would face. "Martinez, I want to make sure you understand what you're getting into," he said. "This isn't about proving a point or making history. This training program will destroy you if you're not absolutely certain you belong there. The failure rate for male candidates is over 80%, and that's after they've been screened and selected from thousands of applicants." "I understand, sir," Sarah replied. "Do you?" he asked. "Because this isn't just about physical training. The men in your class won't want you there. Some of the instructors won't want you there. You'll be fighting an uphill battle from the moment you arrive, and that's before you even begin dealing with the actual training." Sarah looked him directly in the eye. "With respect, sir, I've been fighting uphill battles my entire life. This is just another one." Colonel Harrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Martinez. I'll approve your transfer. But understand that once you walk through those doors, you're on your own. Nobody can help you but yourself." 3 weeks later, Sarah Martinez packed her belongings and reported to the most challenging training facility in the American military. She was one of 47 candidates who had been selected for the program. Only 2 of them were women. The other female candidate, Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, was an academy graduate with an engineering degree and a perfect fitness record. Sarah was the enlisted soldier from a small town in Texas who had worked her way up through the ranks. As she stood with the other candidates on that first morning, listening to the program director outline what lay ahead, Sarah felt the weight of all the years that had brought her to this moment. Every early morning run, every extra hour in the gym, every time she had proven herself to someone who didn't think she belonged, had led to this opportunity. She was ready for the physical challenges. She was prepared for the mental tests. What she wasn't ready for was the discovery that some of her fellow candidates, and even some of the instructors, were willing to cross lines she hadn't imagined in their efforts to ensure she failed. The competition wasn't just about who was strongest or toughest or most determined. It was about who belonged in a world that had never included people like her, and some people were prepared to fight very dirty to keep it that way. The training facility looked like something from another world. Nestled in the mountains of North Carolina, it consisted of modern buildings connected by covered walkways, surrounded by thousands of acres of wilderness that served as the ultimate testing ground. The candidates who arrived there came from every branch of the military and represented the cream of their respective services. They were Rangers, Marines, paratroopers, and Navy personnel who had already proven themselves exceptional in their original roles. Sarah arrived on a Sunday evening along with the other candidates. They were assigned to dormitory-style barracks, with 2 people per room. Sarah's roommate was Lieutenant Walsh, the other female candidate. Jennifer was everything Sarah wasn't: tall, blonde, soft-spoken, and from a military family that traced its service back 3 generations. Her father was a general, her brother was a pilot, and she had grown up on military bases around the world. "I have to admit, I'm surprised there are 2 of us," Jennifer said as they unpacked their belongings. "I thought I might be the only woman who applied." "Why did you apply?" Sarah asked. Jennifer paused, considering the question. "Honestly, because I want to prove that the investment in my education was worthwhile. I went to West Point on the taxpayer's dime, and I feel like I owe it to the military to push myself as far as I can go." "What about you?" Sarah thought about how to answer. She could talk about her childhood dreams, her years of preparation, her desire to serve at the highest level. But all of that seemed too personal to share with someone she had just met, even someone who was facing the same challenges. "I want to be where I can make the biggest difference," she said finally. The first week of training was designed to establish baseline measurements and weed out candidates who had somehow made it through the selection process without being truly ready. The physical tests were brutal but straightforward: endless running, swimming, climbing, and obstacle courses that pushed every candidate to their limits. The academic components covered everything from foreign languages to advanced tactics to emergency medical procedures. Sarah performed well in all areas, but she quickly noticed that her success was being measured differently than that of the male candidates. When she completed a physical test within the required time, instructors would note that she had barely made it. When male candidates finished with similar times, they were praised for their solid performance. When she scored highly on academic tests, she was told she was book smart, in a tone that suggested this wasn't necessarily a compliment in their environment. The real challenges began during the second week, when candidates were divided into small teams for field exercises. These exercises were designed to test not just individual capabilities, but how well candidates could work together under stress. Sarah found herself assigned to a team with 5 male candidates, including Jackson Miller, a Marine who had made it clear from the first day that he didn't think women belonged in the program. Miller was everything Sarah disliked about certain types of military men. He was loud, aggressive, and seemed to view every interaction as a competition he had to win. He had grown up in a military family and had enlisted the day after graduating high school. He was physically strong, tactically sound, and completely convinced that combat was a masculine domain that would be compromised by female participation. "Look," he said to Sarah during their first team meeting, "I don't have anything personal against you, but I think this whole experiment is a mistake. When we get into real situations, I need to know that everyone on my team can pull their weight. I'm not trying to be an asshole, but I've got concerns." "What kind of concerns?" Sarah asked calmly. "Physical concerns, emotional concerns, practical concerns," Miller replied. "What happens if you get captured? What happens if you're injured and need to be carried? What happens if you freeze up at a critical moment?" The other men on the team watched this exchange carefully. Sarah realized that how she handled this moment would set the tone for everything that followed. She could get angry and defensive, which would confirm Miller's suspicions about women being too emotional for this environment. She could try to win him over with charm or diplomacy, which might work, but would also suggest that she needed his approval to belong there. Or she could simply demonstrate through her actions that his concerns were unfounded. "I guess we'll find out," she said simply. Their first field exercise was a navigation and survival challenge that required the team to move 20 miles through mountainous terrain while carrying full packs and completing various tasks along the way. They had 48 hours to reach their destination, and they would be graded on both their individual performance and their effectiveness as a team. Miller immediately assumed leadership of the group, which was fine with Sarah. She had no interest in power struggles that would distract from their mission. Her goal was to perform at the highest level and prove that she belonged there through her contributions, not through politics or personality conflicts. The first day went reasonably well. Sarah kept pace with the group without difficulty and completed all required tasks competently. But that evening, as they set up camp for the night, she noticed that Miller and 2 of the other team members, Rodriguez and Chun, were having quiet conversations that stopped when she approached. Jennifer Walsh's team was camped about a mile away, and during the night, Sarah could hear sounds of argument and conflict from their direction. The next morning, when the teams reconvened at a checkpoint, Jennifer looked exhausted and frustrated. Her team was behind schedule, and there were obvious tensions between the team members. "How are things going?" Sarah asked her during a brief moment when they could speak privately. "Not great," Jennifer admitted. "I think my team leader is trying to prove some kind of point by making everything harder than it needs to be. We're spending more time arguing about decisions than actually implementing them." Sarah's team, meanwhile, was performing well by most measures. They were on schedule, completing their tasks efficiently, and working together without major conflicts. But Sarah was beginning to notice small things that suggested not everyone was committed to their collective success. Equipment that should have been shared equally wasn't being distributed fairly. Information that should have been communicated to all team members was sometimes shared only partially. Nothing overt enough to file a complaint about, but enough to create doubt and distraction. The breakthrough moment came on the second day, when their team encountered an unexpected obstacle. They had been following a trail that was supposed to lead them to their final checkpoint when they discovered that recent heavy rains had washed out a bridge they needed to cross. The stream below was deep and fast-moving, and there was no obvious alternative route that wouldn't add hours to their journey. Miller gathered the team to discuss options, but it was clear that he was struggling with the problem. They could attempt to ford the stream, but that would risk injury and equipment damage. They could backtrack and find another route, but that would likely cause them to exceed their time limit. They could attempt to construct a makeshift bridge, but they had limited materials and time. While Miller was talking through these options with Rodriguez and Chun, Sarah was studying the situation more carefully. She noticed that about 200 yards upstream, a large tree had fallen across the narrowest part of the stream. The tree wasn't visible from their current position, which was why Miller and the others hadn't spotted it, but it looked like it might provide a way across if they could reach it safely. There might be another option, Sarah said, interrupting the discussion. Miller looked annoyed at being interrupted. What's that? Sarah explained what she had observed and suggested they investigate the fallen tree as a potential crossing point. Miller was skeptical, but when they hiked upstream and saw the tree for themselves, it was clear that Sarah had found their solution. Crossing the fallen tree required careful coordination and precise teamwork. The tree was slippery from the recent rain, and the stream below was deep enough that a fall would be dangerous. Sarah volunteered to go first, securing a rope that could be used to help the others maintain their balance. It was risky, but someone had to take that risk, and she was confident in her balance and agility. The crossing was successful, and the team reached their final checkpoint with time to spare. They had performed better than most other teams, and their success was largely due to Sarah's observation and problem-solving skills. But when they were debriefed by the instructors, Miller took credit for finding the alternative crossing point. Martinez spotted the tree initially, he said when pressed for details, but the decision to use it and the plan for getting across safely was a team effort. Sarah said nothing during the debriefing, but she was learning valuable lessons about the dynamics she would face throughout the program. Her contributions would be welcome when they were needed, but she shouldn't expect credit or recognition for them. Her job was to perform at the highest level while allowing others to take credit for successes and blame her for any failures. The academic components of the program were less complicated in terms of team dynamics, but they presented their own challenges. Sarah had always been a strong student, but the material they were covering required a level of focus and retention that pushed everyone to their limits. They were learning advanced tactical concepts, studying the psychology of leadership under extreme stress, and mastering technical skills that required hours of practice to develop. She excelled in most areas, but she noticed that her academic success was creating a different kind of tension with some of the male candidates. Miller and his friends began making comments about her being a grind who was trying to make everyone else look bad by studying too hard. They suggested that her high test scores were more about memorization than real understanding, and that academic performance in a classroom setting had little relationship to effectiveness in real-world situations. The thing is, Rodriguez explained to her one evening, this isn't college. Nobody cares if you can write a perfect essay about tactical theory. What matters is whether you can make good decisions when people are shooting at you and everything is going wrong. Sarah understood the point he was making, but she also recognized it as another way of diminishing her accomplishments. The same men who criticized her for studying too hard were spending their own free time in the gym, working to improve their physical performance. The idea that academic preparation was somehow less valuable than physical preparation was a convenient way to discount an area where she was clearly excelling. The real test of these dynamics came during the 4th week of training, when candidates were required to complete a series of leadership exercises. Each candidate would take turns leading the others through complex scenarios that required quick thinking, clear communication, and the ability to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. Sarah's turn to lead came on a rainy Wednesday morning. The scenario involved a simulated hostage rescue in an urban environment, with multiple moving parts and strict time constraints. She would have to coordinate the actions of her team members while responding to new information that would be provided throughout the exercise. She had spent considerable time preparing for this moment, studying similar scenarios and developing contingency plans for various complications that might arise. But she also knew that her success would depend on whether her team members were willing to follow her instructions promptly and precisely. The exercise began well. Sarah's planning was solid, her communication was clear, and her team moved efficiently through the early stages of the scenario. But about halfway through, complications began arising that seemed designed to test her ability to maintain control under pressure. Miller began questioning her decisions publicly, suggesting alternative approaches at moments when quick action was essential. Rodriguez and Chin started implementing her instructions slowly, requiring repeated clarification for orders that should have been straightforward. The scenario itself became increasingly complex, with new complications being introduced by the instructors at a pace that felt unusually rapid. Sarah realized that she was being tested in ways that went beyond the official parameters of the exercise. Her leadership skills were being evaluated, but so was her ability to maintain effectiveness when some team members were actively working against her success. She adapted her approach, giving simpler and more direct orders, confirming that instructions had been understood before moving on to the next phase, and finding ways to work around the resistance she was encountering. By the end of the exercise, her team had successfully completed their mission, despite the various obstacles they had faced. During the debriefing, the instructors focused heavily on the team dynamics they had observed. They noted that Sarah had demonstrated good adaptability and clear communication skills, but they also suggested that she needed to work on building better rapport with her team members. Leadership isn't just about giving orders, Master Sergeant Thompson told her. It's about inspiring people to want to follow you. If your team members aren't fully committed to your success, that's something you need to address. Sarah understood what he was saying, but she also recognized the impossible standard it implied. She was being held responsible for the resistance and sabotage she had encountered, even though it was clearly motivated by factors beyond her control. If male candidates had faced similar resistance from their team members, the focus would have been on the team members' failure to follow orders properly, not on the leader's failure to inspire compliance. That evening, she had a long conversation with Jennifer Walsh about their experiences so far. Jennifer's challenges had been different, but equally frustrating. Her team members weren't actively sabotaging her efforts, but they weren't taking her seriously either. They treated her suggestions as interesting ideas worthy of consideration rather than orders that should be followed immediately. I feel like I'm fighting two different battles, Jennifer confided. There's the official program, which is hard enough. And then there's this other battle to prove that I deserve to be here at all. I'm starting to wonder if it's worth it. Sarah understood Jennifer's frustration, but she also knew that giving up wasn't an option for her. She had invested too much of her life in reaching this point, and she believed too strongly in the importance of what she was trying to accomplish. They want us to quit, she told Jennifer. That's the whole point of making it harder for us. If we give up now, it proves they were right all along. As the weeks passed, the training became more intense, and the challenges more complex. Sarah continued to perform at a high level, but she was also becoming aware that some of her fellow candidates were coordinating their efforts to undermine her success. Equipment would disappear from her gear. Information about schedule changes would reach her late or not at all. During team exercises, she would find herself isolated from the communication networks that her teammates used to coordinate their actions. None of these incidents were dramatic enough to warrant official complaints, but their cumulative effect was significant. Sarah was spending extra time and energy dealing with artificial obstacles that her male counterparts didn't face. She was succeeding despite these challenges, but the extra stress was taking its toll. The breaking point came during the 8th week of training, when candidates were preparing for their most challenging exercise yet, a week-long field operation that would test everything they had learned so far. This exercise would largely determine who would advance to the final phase of the program, and who would be sent back to their original units. Sarah had been looking forward to this challenge because it would allow her to demonstrate her capabilities in a more comprehensive way. But 3 days before the exercise was scheduled to begin, she discovered that someone had been systematically sabotaging her preparation. Her study materials had been tampered with, containing information that was outdated or simply wrong. Her equipment had been subtly damaged in ways that might not be discovered until she was in the field and depending on it for her safety. Most seriously, she learned through overheard conversations that some of the male candidates were planning to ensure her failure during the upcoming exercise through coordinated non-cooperation that would be difficult for instructors to detect or prove. Sarah realized that she had reached a critical moment. She could report what she had discovered to the program instructors, but doing so would likely be seen as evidence that she couldn't handle the pressure and competition inherent in the program. She could confront the candidates she suspected of sabotage, but that would likely escalate the conflict and make her remaining time in the program even more difficult. Or she could find a way to turn their sabotage against them, demonstrating not just that she could overcome their efforts to undermine her, but that she was resourceful and resilient enough to succeed under any conditions. The decision she made would determine not just her own future, but would send a message about what was possible for other women who might follow in her footsteps. Sarah spent the weekend before the major field exercise developing a strategy that would allow her to succeed despite the sabotage she was facing. She couldn't prevent the other candidates from working against her, but she could prepare for their interference and find ways to minimize its impact on her performance. First, she created backup plans for every piece of equipment she would be using. She identified alternative sources for critical gear and developed redundancies for anything that might be damaged or go missing. She also began carrying essential items with her at all times, rather than leaving them in storage areas where they could be tampered with. Second, she started developing independent information sources about the upcoming exercise. Instead of relying solely on official briefings and shared materials, she cultivated relationships with instructors and support staff who could provide her with accurate and timely information. She was careful to do this in ways that couldn't be seen as seeking unfair advantage, but rather as demonstrating the kind of thorough preparation that was expected of all candidates. Most importantly, she began documenting the sabotage she was experiencing. She took photographs of damaged equipment, made detailed notes about missing or altered materials, and quietly recorded conversations when possible. She wasn't planning to use this documentation as the basis for complaints, but she wanted to have evidence available if the situation escalated to a point where official intervention became necessary. Jennifer Walsh was facing her own challenges, but they were different in nature. Rather than active sabotage, she was dealing with a more subtle form of exclusion. Her male teammates weren't working against her directly, but they weren't including her in informal planning sessions, sharing unofficial information, or treating her as a full member of their group. She was being isolated rather than attacked. "I almost think what you're dealing with is easier," Jennifer told Sarah during one of their private conversations. "At least when people are actively working against you, you know where you stand. This feeling like I'm being tolerated but not really accepted is driving me crazy." Sarah understood Jennifer's frustration, but she wasn't sure she agreed that active sabotage was easier to handle than social exclusion. Both approaches were designed to make them fail, just through different mechanisms. The men who were excluding Jennifer were betting that she would eventually become discouraged and quit. The men who were sabotaging Sarah were trying to create conditions that would make her failure seem inevitable. The field exercise began on a Monday morning with the most comprehensive briefing any of the candidates had received so far. They would be operating in teams of 6, moving through a 100-square-mile area of wilderness while completing a series of increasingly complex missions. The exercise would last 6 days and would test every skill they had developed during their training. Sarah was assigned to a team that included Miller, Rodriguez, and 3 other candidates she hadn't worked with extensively. Miller was designated as the team leader for the first mission, with leadership rotating among team members for subsequent missions. Sarah would lead the team during the 4th mission, which was described as one of the most challenging scenarios they would face. The first 3 days of the exercise went better than Sarah had expected. Despite the tensions that existed between team members, they were able to work together effectively when focused on their missions. Miller proved to be a competent leader, and the team completed their assigned tasks within the required time frames. But Sarah noticed that her teammates were being particularly careful to follow official protocols in all their interactions with her. They weren't friendly, but they weren't openly hostile either. She realized they were waiting for her turn to lead before implementing whatever strategy they had developed to ensure her failure. Her suspicions were confirmed on the 4th morning, when she discovered that critical equipment she had prepared for her leadership mission was missing from her pack. The missing items included specialized communication gear, navigation tools, and emergency medical supplies that would be essential for the mission she was supposed to lead. When she reported the missing equipment to Miller, he expressed concern and offered to help her search for it. But his assistance was perfunctory, and it was clear that he wasn't surprised by what had happened. The other team members also offered to help, but their efforts were similarly half-hearted. "We need to report this to the instructors," Sarah said. "We can't complete the mission without this equipment." "Are you sure it's really missing?" Rodriguez asked. "Maybe you just packed it in a different location. These packs are pretty complicated." Miller nodded in agreement. "Why don't we spend a little more time looking before we involve the instructors? They're not going to be happy if we report missing equipment that turns out to just be misplaced." Sarah realized that her teammates were hoping she would either find a way to complete the mission without the missing equipment, which would likely result in failure, or report the missing equipment to instructors, which would make her look careless or incompetent. Either outcome would support their narrative that she wasn't ready for this level of responsibility. She also realized that this was probably her best opportunity to demonstrate the kind of adaptability and resourcefulness that the program was designed to identify. Rather than allowing her teammates to force her into a no-win situation, she needed to find a third option that would allow her to succeed despite their sabotage. "You're right," she told Miller. "Let me take another look at my gear and see if I can solve this problem without involving the instructors." What Sarah didn't tell her teammates was that she had anticipated this possibility and had prepared accordingly. Over the previous few weeks, she had been gradually acquiring backup equipment and storing it in locations her teammates didn't know about. She had also developed alternative communication and navigation methods that didn't depend on the standard issue gear. While her teammates continued their pretense of searching for the missing equipment, Sarah quietly retrieved her backup gear and reconfigured her mission plan to account for the changed circumstances. By the time they were supposed to begin the mission, she was ready to proceed. The mission itself was a complex scenario involving the rescue of simulated hostages from a fortified position while avoiding detection by enemy forces in the surrounding area. Success required precise coordination, careful timing, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Sarah's leadership during this mission was some of the best she had demonstrated during the entire program. Despite the sabotage she had faced and the continued resistance from some of her teammates, she guided the team through each phase of the mission with confidence and skill. Her backup equipment worked flawlessly, her alternative planning proved effective, and her ability to maintain team cohesion under stress impressed even the instructors who were observing the exercise. The team completed the mission ahead of schedule and with better results than most other teams had achieved in similar scenarios. During the post-mission debrief, the instructors praised Sarah's leadership and noted that she had demonstrated exceptional adaptability and problem-solving skills. But Sarah's success during the mission also escalated the conflict with her teammates. Miller and Rodriguez were clearly frustrated that their sabotage had not only failed but had actually provided Sarah with an opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities more convincingly than might otherwise have been possible. That evening, as the team set up camp for the night, Sarah overheard Miller talking with Rodriguez and Chen about how to handle the remaining 2 days of the exercise. "She got lucky today," Miller was saying. "But we've got 2 more missions, and she can't be prepared for everything. We just need to be more creative. What if she reports what we're doing?" Chen asked. "She won't," Rodriguez replied. "She knows that reporting it would make her look weak. She's trying to prove she can handle anything we throw at her." Sarah realized that her teammates had correctly identified her reluctance to file official complaints, and they were planning to use that knowledge against her. They understood that she was trying to succeed through superior performance rather than through appeals to authority, and they were betting that she would continue to follow that approach even as their sabotage became more extreme. The next morning brought a new mission that required the team to traverse difficult terrain while carrying simulated wounded personnel. This mission was designed to test physical endurance, teamwork, and the ability to maintain performance standards while under extreme stress. Sarah was not the designated leader for this mission, but she quickly realized that her teammates were implementing a more sophisticated sabotage strategy. Instead of targeting her equipment or information, they were subtly undermining the team's overall performance in ways that would make it difficult for anyone to identify specific individuals as being responsible. Equipment was being shared inefficiently, with some team members carrying much more weight than others. Navigation decisions were being made slowly and with unnecessary debate, causing the team to fall behind schedule. Communication protocols were being followed inconsistently, creating confusion about assignments and priorities. The cumulative effect was that the team was performing poorly despite having all the resources and information they needed to succeed. And because Sarah was not the leader for this mission, she was in the difficult position of watching the team fail while having limited authority to intervene. She realized that this was another test of her judgment and leadership potential. She could follow the chain of command strictly and watch the mission fail, which would reflect poorly on everyone involved. She could attempt to take unofficial leadership of the team, which might be seen as insubordination or an inability to work effectively with others. Or she could find ways to support the official leader while quietly addressing the problems that were undermining the team's effectiveness. Sarah chose the third approach, working behind the scenes to redistribute equipment more efficiently, providing navigation assistance when requested, and facilitating communication between team members who seemed to be having difficulty coordinating their efforts. Her interventions were subtle enough that they couldn't be seen as challenges to the official leader's authority, but they were effective enough to help the team recover from their early difficulties and complete the mission successfully. The instructors noted the team's rocky start, but praised their ability to adapt and improve their performance during the mission. They also specifically commended Sarah for her supportive role and her willingness to prioritize team success over individual recognition. But Sarah's teammates were becoming increasingly frustrated with their inability to create conditions that would lead to her failure. Their sabotage had not only been unsuccessful, it had provided her with opportunities to demonstrate exactly the kinds of leadership and problem-solving skills the program was designed to identify. On the final night of the exercise, Sarah discovered that Miller and several other candidates had been meeting secretly to plan a more dramatic intervention. She overheard them discussing plans to create a situation during the final mission that would force her to choose between her own safety and the success of the team mission. If she prioritizes her own safety, she proves she doesn't have what it takes, Miller was explaining. If she prioritizes the mission, we can make sure something goes wrong that makes her look incompetent or dangerous. Sarah realized that her teammates were planning to create a genuinely dangerous situation that could result in serious injury to herself or others. This represented a significant escalation beyond the equipment sabotage and social manipulation they had been using previously. She faced a critical decision about how to respond. She could report what she had learned to the instructors, but doing so would likely end the careers of several candidates and might be seen as evidence that she couldn't handle the competitive environment of special operations training. She could confront the candidates directly, but that might lead to a violent confrontation that could get everyone involved kicked out of the program. Or she could prepare for whatever they were planning and find a way to turn their sabotage against them one final time, demonstrating not just that she could overcome their efforts, but that she was resourceful enough to anticipate and counter threats from any source. The decision she made would determine not just her own fate, but would establish a precedent for how future female candidates would be treated in similar programs. If she succeeded despite everything her teammates had done to undermine her, it would send a message that women could compete at the highest levels even under the most adverse conditions. If she failed, it would reinforce beliefs about women being unsuitable for special operations roles. As Sarah prepared for the final mission of the exercise, she knew that she was fighting for much more than her own career. She was fighting for the future of every woman who might someday want to serve in roles that had traditionally been closed to them. The pressure was enormous, but so was her determination to succeed. The final mission of the 6-day exercise was designed to be the most comprehensive test of everything the candidates had learned during their training. It would involve elements of reconnaissance, direct action, and extraction, all while operating in a simulated hostile environment with multiple moving parts and time-critical decision points. Sarah was designated as the team leader for this mission, which meant she would be responsible for planning, coordination, and execution of their most complex challenge yet. Under normal circumstances, this would have been an opportunity to demonstrate her leadership capabilities at the highest level. But she knew that her teammates were planning something that would turn this opportunity into a potential disaster. She spent the early morning hours before the mission developing contingency plans for various scenarios, including several that accounted for deliberate sabotage or non-cooperation from her own team members. She couldn't predict exactly what they were planning, but she could prepare for a range of possibilities and ensure that she had alternatives available when their strategy became clear. The mission briefing revealed a complex scenario involving the infiltration of a simulated enemy compound, the gathering of critical intelligence, and the extraction of a high-value target, all while avoiding detection by security forces in the area. The team would have to move through several miles of challenging terrain, coordinate with external support elements, and adapt to changing conditions based on information they would receive during the mission. Sarah's planning was thorough and professional. She assigned responsibilities based on each team member's strengths, established communication protocols that would allow for flexible coordination, and identified multiple routes and options for each phase of the mission. Her briefing to the team was clear and comprehensive, and she answered their questions with confidence and detail. But she also noticed that Miller and Rodriguez were asking questions that seemed designed to identify potential weaknesses in her plan rather than to clarify their own responsibilities. They were probing for information about timing, routes, and communication procedures in ways that suggested they were looking for opportunities to exploit. The mission began before dawn, with the team moving through dense forest toward their first objective. Sarah had positioned herself in the middle of the team formation, where she could maintain communication with all team members while keeping the most potentially problematic individuals within her direct observation. For the first several hours, the mission proceeded according to plan. The team made good time through the terrain, maintained proper spacing and communication discipline, and successfully reached their first checkpoint without incident. Sarah began to wonder if she had misunderstood what she had overheard the previous evening, or if her teammates had decided against implementing whatever they had been planning. But, as they approached the most challenging phase of the mission, the infiltration of the enemy compound, Sarah noticed that Miller and Rodriguez were not following her positioning instructions precisely. They were maintaining radio contact and appeared to be completing their assigned tasks, but they were doing so in ways that deviated slightly from her plan. These deviations were subtle enough that they could be explained as reasonable adaptations to field conditions, but Sarah recognized them as the beginning of whatever strategy her teammates had developed. They were creating small disconnects between her plan and their actual positions, setting the stage for something larger. The infiltration itself required precise timing and coordination. Sarah had planned for the team to approach the compound from 3 different directions simultaneously, with each element responsible for specific tasks that would support the overall mission. Success depended on everyone being in the right place at the right time and executing their assignments exactly as briefed. As the team moved into position for the infiltration, Sarah received a radio message from Rodriguez indicating that his element had encountered unexpected obstacles and needed to modify their approach route. The change he was requesting would delay his timeline and require adjustments to the coordination between all elements. Under normal circumstances, this kind of adaptive planning was exactly what mission leaders were expected to handle. But Sarah recognized this as the beginning of the sabotage strategy her teammates had developed. They were creating artificial complications that would force her to make rapid decisions with incomplete information, increasing the likelihood that something would go wrong. She approved Rodriguez's route change, but also activated one of her contingency plans, repositioning other elements to maintain the timing and coordination the mission required. Her adaptations were successful, and the team was able to proceed with the infiltration despite the complications Rodriguez had introduced. But, as they moved into the compound, Sarah realized that the sabotage was more extensive than she had anticipated. Miller was not in his assigned position, and Chun was implementing his assignment differently than they had practiced. Both of these changes were creating gaps in the team's coverage and timing that could compromise the entire mission. More seriously, Sarah began to suspect that her radio communications were being monitored or intercepted in ways that were providing her teammates with information about her planning and decision-making that they shouldn't have had access to. They seemed to be anticipating her adaptations and countering them in real time. The situation reached a crisis point when the team was supposed to extract their simulated high-value target from the compound. This phase of the mission required synchronized movement by all team elements, with precise timing that would allow them to complete their objectives and withdraw before simulated enemy reinforcements could respond. Sarah gave the signal to begin the extraction, but instead of the coordinated response she had planned, she found herself dealing with a series of equipment failures and communication problems that seemed to cascade from one team member to another. Rodriguez reported that his equipment was malfunctioning. Miller indicated that he was having difficulty with his assigned route. Chen announced that he was encountering resistance that hadn't been anticipated in their planning. Each of these problems was individually plausible, but collectively they represented a complete breakdown of the mission plan. Sarah realized that she was facing a deliberate and coordinated effort to create conditions that would make it impossible for her to complete the mission successfully. But she also realized that her teammates had made a critical miscalculation. By focusing so intently on sabotaging her plan, they had revealed their own positions and capabilities in ways that she could exploit. She had been tracking their actual locations throughout the mission, and she understood their real capabilities better than they realized. Instead of trying to salvage her original plan, Sarah made a rapid decision to implement an entirely different approach. Using communication channels that her teammates weren't monitoring and positioning information they didn't have, she coordinated directly with external support elements to extract the high-value target through a route that bypassed her own team members entirely. This decision required her to take significant personal risk, moving alone through areas that would normally be covered by team members. But It also allowed her to complete the primary mission objective despite the sabotage she was facing from her own teammates. The extraction was successful, and the simulated high-value target was secured ahead of schedule despite all the complications that had been created. But Sarah's teammates were furious that their sabotage had not only failed but had been turned against them in such a dramatic way. During the immediate aftermath of the mission, while the team was still in the field waiting for transportation back to the training facility, Miller confronted Sarah directly about what had happened. "You undermined the entire team structure," he accused her. "You were supposed to be leading us, not working around us." "I was leading the mission," Sarah replied calmly. "My responsibility was to complete our objectives, and that's what happened." "By abandoning your own team," Rodriguez added. "That's not leadership, that's selfishness." Sarah looked at the men who had spent weeks trying to sabotage her success and realized that they were now trying to frame their own deliberate non-cooperation as evidence of her failure as a leader. They had created a no-win situation where following their sabotage would have led to mission failure, while working around their sabotage could be characterized as abandoning team concepts. "The mission was successful," she said simply. "That's what matters." But she knew that the real test would come during the official debriefing back at the training facility. The instructors would analyze every aspect of the mission, including team dynamics, decision-making processes, and adherence to protocols. Her teammates would likely present their version of events in ways that portrayed her adaptations as evidence of poor leadership or an inability to work effectively with others. The transportation back to the training facility was tense and quiet. Sarah spent the time reviewing her decisions and preparing for the questions she would face during the debriefing. She was confident that she had made the right choices given the circumstances she faced, but she also understood that those circumstances would be difficult to explain without directly accusing her teammates of deliberate sabotage. Jennifer Walsh was waiting when Sarah's team returned to the facility. Her own final mission had been challenging but had not involved the kind of internal conflict that Sarah had experienced. She could see immediately that something significant had happened. "How did it go?" Jennifer asked during a brief moment when they could speak privately. "I'll tell you later," Sarah replied. "Right now I need to prepare for the debriefing." The official debriefing took place that evening, with all team members present along with the instructors who had been observing the mission. The session was recorded and would be reviewed by senior personnel who would make decisions about which candidates would advance to the final phase of the program. Miller presented his version of events first, describing a mission that had been compromised by Sarah's decision to abandon established team procedures in favor of individualistic approaches that had put everyone at risk. He portrayed her adaptations as evidence that she prioritized personal success over team effectiveness and suggested that her actions had created dangerous situations that could have resulted in serious injuries in a real-world scenario. Rodriguez and Chin supported Miller's narrative, describing communication breakdowns and coordination failures that had resulted from Sarah's decision to deviate from established plans. They presented themselves as team members who had tried to maintain mission effectiveness despite leadership failures that had created increasingly chaotic conditions. When it was Sarah's turn to respond, she faced a critical choice. She could present evidence of the sabotage she had faced and explain how her adaptations had been necessary responses to deliberate non-cooperation from her teammates. But doing so would require her to directly accuse her fellow candidates of conduct that could end their military careers. Alternatively, she could accept responsibility for the mission outcomes without explaining the circumstances that had led to her decisions. This approach would likely result in negative evaluations of her leadership performance, but it would avoid creating a situation that could be seen as her inability to handle team conflicts without external intervention. Sarah chose a middle path. She acknowledged that the mission had involved significant challenges and unexpected complications, but she focused on the positive outcomes that had been achieved rather than on the conflicts that had occurred. She described her adaptations as responses to field conditions rather than as reactions to team member behavior, and she emphasized the successful completion of primary objectives despite various obstacles. Her response was professional and measured, but it also left many questions unanswered about why the mission had unfolded as it had. The instructors noted the discrepancies between different team members' accounts of events, and they indicated that they would be conducting additional interviews and analysis before reaching conclusions about individual performance. After the debriefing, Sarah realized that she was facing the most uncertain period of her entire military career. She had successfully completed one of the most challenging training programs in the world, despite facing sabotage and resistance from her own teammates. But the very success of her adaptations had created questions about her leadership style and team-building capabilities that could be used to justify her elimination from the program. The next few days would determine whether her years of preparation and sacrifice had been worthwhile, or whether the barriers she had tried to overcome had ultimately proven too powerful to defeat. Everything depended on how the instructors and program leadership interpreted the complex dynamics they had observed during the final exercise. As Sarah waited for the final evaluation results, she knew that her individual success or failure would have implications far beyond her own career. Other women were watching to see whether it was possible to succeed in programs like this one, or whether the obstacles were too significant to overcome. The precedent that was set by her experience would influence policy decisions and cultural attitudes for years to come. She had done everything she could to prove herself worthy of advancement. Now she would have to wait to see if that would be enough. The evaluation period following the final exercise was the longest week of Sarah's life. While candidates waited for results, they continued with regular training activities and academic classes, but everyone understood that these activities were essentially meaningless compared to the decisions being made behind closed doors about their futures. Sarah maintained her normal routines, but she was acutely aware that every interaction with instructors and staff might provide clues about how her performance was being evaluated. She noticed that some candidates were being called in for additional interviews or clarification sessions, while others seemed to be receiving more informal feedback from instructors during regular training activities. Jennifer Walsh was among those who received additional interview requests, which she interpreted as a positive sign. The instructors seemed to want more information about her leadership potential and career goals, suggesting that she was being seriously considered for advancement to the final phase of the program. Sarah, by contrast, received no additional interview requests and noticed that her interactions with instructors had become notably formal and distant. This could indicate that her advancement was considered certain and no additional evaluation was needed, but it could also suggest that her elimination had already been decided and further assessment was unnecessary. On Thursday afternoon, 3 days before the final results were scheduled to be announced, Sarah was called to the office of Colonel Patricia Hayes, the program director. Colonel Hayes was a decorated combat veteran who had been instrumental in developing policies that opened special operations training to female candidates. Her support had been critical in creating the opportunities that Sarah was now pursuing. "Sit down, Martinez," Colonel Hayes said without preamble. "We need to talk." Sarah took a seat and waited for Colonel Hayes to continue. The colonel's expression was serious, and Sarah prepared herself for news that might end her military aspirations. "Your performance during this program has been exceptional," Colonel Hayes began. "Your physical scores, academic achievements, and leadership demonstrations have all been at the highest levels. Under normal circumstances, your advancement to the final phase would be automatic." Sarah felt a moment of relief before processing the implications of the phrase, "under normal circumstances." However, Colonel Hayes continued, "There are concerns about the team dynamics that occurred during the final exercise. Some of the feedback we've received suggests that you may have difficulty building consensus and working collaboratively with team members who have different perspectives or approaches." Sarah realized that Miller and his allies had succeeded in creating exactly the narrative they had intended. Her success despite their sabotage was being reframed as evidence that she was a difficult team member who couldn't work effectively with others. "I understand the concerns," Sarah said carefully, "but I would respectfully suggest that the circumstances of that mission were unusual and may not be representative of normal team dynamics." Colonel Hayes studied her for a long moment. "Are you suggesting that there were factors involved in that mission that aren't reflected in the official reports?" Sarah faced the same choice she had confronted during the debriefing. She could present evidence of the sabotage she had experienced and potentially destroy the careers of her fellow candidates, or she could accept the negative evaluation and hope that her overall performance would be sufficient to overcome these concerns. "I'm suggesting that field conditions can create challenges that require adaptive leadership approaches," Sarah replied. "My primary responsibility was mission success, and that objective was achieved." Colonel Hayes nodded slowly. "I appreciate your perspective, Martinez, but I need you to understand that leadership in special operations requires more than just mission success. It requires the ability to inspire confidence and cooperation from team members, even under the most difficult circumstances." "I understand, ma'am," Sarah said. "The decision about your advancement hasn't been made yet," Colonel Hayes continued. But I wanted you to be aware of the concerns that have been raised and to give you an opportunity to address them if you have additional information that might be relevant. Sarah realized that Colonel Hayes was giving her a carefully worded invitation to report the sabotage she had experienced. But she also understood that taking advantage of this invitation would fundamentally change the nature of her achievement. Instead of succeeding through superior performance despite obstacles, she would be succeeding through institutional protection and intervention. I appreciate the opportunity to address these concerns, Sarah said. But I believe my performance throughout the program demonstrates my ability to work effectively with others and to prioritize mission success over personal considerations. I'm confident that additional opportunities will confirm these capabilities. Colonel Hayes looked surprised by Sarah's response, but also impressed. Very well, Martinez. The final results will be announced on Sunday. Until then, continue with your regular training activities. As Sarah left Colonel Hayes' office, she realized that she had probably just made the decision that would determine her fate in the program. By refusing to report the sabotage, she had chosen to succeed or fail based purely on her own performance rather than on institutional intervention against her opponents. The remaining days before the results were announced passed slowly. Sarah maintained her training routines and participated in all required activities, but she found it difficult to concentrate on anything other than the upcoming announcement. She had invested years of her life in reaching this point, and everything depended on decisions that were beyond her control. On Saturday evening, the day before results were to be announced, Sarah experienced the incident that would become legendary in special operations training circles. She had been preparing her dress uniform for the announcement ceremony when she discovered that it was missing from her storage locker. At first, she assumed that she had simply misplaced it or that it was being cleaned or repaired by the facility maintenance staff. But when she checked with the appropriate personnel, she learned that no uniforms had been sent for cleaning and that there was no record of any maintenance work being performed on her gear. A systematic search of her storage areas revealed that not only was her dress uniform missing, but several other items of military clothing had also disappeared. Most significantly, the combat uniform she was supposed to wear to the ceremony had been taken as well. Sarah realized that someone had stolen her uniforms as a final act of sabotage, intended to humiliate her at the moment when her fate in the program would be determined. Appearing at the results ceremony in civilian clothes or in an incomplete uniform would be a serious breach of military protocol that could be used to justify her elimination from the program regardless of her performance. She reported the missing uniforms to the appropriate authorities, but it was Saturday evening, and most administrative personnel were not available until Monday. The ceremony was scheduled for Sunday morning, and there was no realistic possibility that replacement uniforms could be obtained in time. Sarah spent most of Saturday night trying to find solutions to this problem. She contacted other candidates to see if anyone had spare uniforms that might fit her, but the sizing was too specific for this approach to work. She explored the possibility of obtaining uniforms from base supply facilities, but these were closed until Monday morning. By Sunday morning, Sarah had concluded that she would have to attend the ceremony in civilian clothes and accept whatever consequences resulted from this breach of protocol. It was a humiliating end to her time in the program, but she wasn't willing to miss the ceremony entirely. As she was preparing to leave for the announcement ceremony, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found Master Sergeant Thompson, one of the senior instructors from the program. "Martinez," he said, "I heard about your uniform situation. I thought you might be able to use these." He handed her a garment bag containing a complete military uniform, but not the standard Army dress uniform she had been expecting. Instead, it was a Navy SEAL combat uniform, complete with all appropriate insignia and awards. Sarah was confused. "Sergeant, I don't understand. This isn't my uniform." Master Sergeant Thompson smiled. "No, it's not. It belonged to a friend of mine who completed SEAL training about 5 years ago. She asked me to give it to you if you ever needed it." Sarah realized what she was looking at. This wasn't just any Navy SEAL uniform. It was the uniform of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, the first woman to successfully complete Navy SEAL training and one of Sarah's personal heroes. Lieutenant Commander Chun had faced many of the same challenges that Sarah was experiencing, and she had not only overcome them but had gone on to a distinguished career in special operations. "She wanted you to know," Master Sergeant Thompson continued, "that some battles are worth fighting in whatever uniform you have available." Sarah understood immediately what Lieutenant Commander Chun was communicating. By wearing a SEAL uniform to the ceremony, Sarah would be making a statement about her intentions and capabilities that would be impossible to ignore. She would be declaring that if the Army wasn't ready to recognize her achievements, other branches of the military might be more welcoming. More importantly, she would be demonstrating that the theft of her uniform had not defeated her, but had instead provided her with an opportunity to make a statement about her resilience and determination that would be more powerful than any traditional uniform could have been. Sarah quickly changed into the SEAL uniform, which fit her perfectly. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw not just a soldier who had overcome obstacles, but a warrior who was ready to take her place among the most elite forces in the military. The reaction when she arrived at the ceremony was everything she could have hoped for. The other candidates stared in shock at the sight of her wearing SEAL gear. Miller and his allies looked horrified as they realized that their sabotage had backfired spectacularly, giving Sarah an opportunity to make a statement they had never anticipated. The instructors and program leadership were clearly impressed by her adaptability and by the symbolic power of her appearance. Colonel Hayes gave her a subtle nod of approval that suggested the message had been received and understood. When the results were announced, Sarah Martinez was among the candidates selected for advancement to the final phase of the program. But, more importantly, her appearance at the ceremony in Navy SEAL gear had sent a message throughout the special operations community that would have lasting implications. The message was simple: attempts to humiliate or sabotage female candidates would not be successful. Instead, they would provide opportunities for these women to demonstrate exactly the kind of resilience, adaptability, and determination that special operations required. Word of Sarah's appearance at the ceremony spread quickly through military networks. Lieutenant Commander Chin called her personally to congratulate her and to offer mentorship as she continued her training. Other female veterans reached out to share their own experiences and to express their support. More significantly, policy discussions about women in special operations began to change. Sarah's experience had demonstrated that the biggest obstacles facing female candidates were not physical or mental limitations, but cultural resistance and deliberate sabotage from their male counterparts. This recognition led to changes in training protocols, evaluation methods, and accountability systems that would benefit future generations of female candidates. Miller, Rodriguez, and the other candidates who had participated in the sabotage were quietly eliminated from the program during the following week. Their elimination was officially attributed to performance concerns and team compatibility issues, but everyone understood what had really happened. Jennifer Walsh also advanced to the final phase of the program, and she and Sarah became part of the first class of female candidates to complete the entire training pipeline successfully. Their graduation ceremony made national news and marked a historic moment in the integration of women into special operations roles. Years later, when Sarah had become a senior leader in the special operations community, she would often tell young female candidates about the importance of turning obstacles into opportunities. The theft of her uniform, which was intended to humiliate and defeat her, had instead become the moment that defined her career and helped change the military forever. She still had the Navy SEAL uniform that Lieutenant Commander Chin had provided for her, and she would occasionally wear it to ceremonies and events as a reminder that true warriors adapt to whatever circumstances they face. The uniform had become a symbol not just of her individual success, but of the progress that was possible when determined individuals refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose on them. Sarah's story became required reading at military academies and was used in leadership training programs across all branches of the service. It demonstrated that the most powerful response to discrimination and sabotage was not complaints or appeals to authority, but superior performance and unshakable determination to succeed regardless of the obstacles. Most importantly, it proved that when someone steals your uniform to try to stop you from achieving your dreams, the best response is to show up wearing an even better one.